Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rock critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains
nuclear-powered!
And today, we are going to discuss nuclear power, but a specific, accident involving nuclear power, and it's always the accidents that are the problem with nuclear power. There's a few issues with nuclear power in general, but it's really the accidents that are alarming because of what kind of horrible things can happen whenever gamma rays are unleashed. You don't want any of that. We don't want anything to do with any of that. And neither did Hisashi Ouchi. He was an employee of JCO, a Japanese nuclear fuel cycle company. And he, suffered an extremely terrible, horrible accident. But he's actually not the only victim of this particular accident, and the accident itself is often misstated and poorly explained, as is Ouchi's fate, and the reasons behind it. So we're going to talk about the truth of the situation. This is the story of the horrible death of Hisashi Ouchi. As strange as it is to consider, Japan has actually relied quite a bit on nuclear power over the years. You'd think they wouldn't really like it very much for reasons I don't think I have to explain. But, yeah, for a while, 30% of Japan's electricity was provided by nuclear energy. They, in themselves, developed many methods to make the process safer and more effective. And nuclear power gets a bad rap because, well, it can be dangerous if it's handled improperly. And people are people, so of course accidents happen. I don't think the Chernobyl disaster needs any introduction. Even in America, we've had a few scares, but nothing on that scale. Fukushima, in Japan, is probably the worst it ever got for them. But I'm not making this video to demonize nuclear power, because frankly, in terms of emissions, you can't beat nuclear power. It doesn't have any emission, at least as far as the atmosphere is concerned, with the exception of the literal tons of nuclear waste that has to sit around for thousands of years because it can't be touched until that time. But we don't need to talk about that. That's not important. Shh. Don't worry about it. Anyway, the accidents we're going to discuss involve the Tokai village. It's located at the Abaraki Prefecture in Japan. These accidents actually occurred within spitting distance of each other. The first in 1997, and the second in 1999. Now, the 97 accident wasn't good, but it wasn't as bad as the 1999 one. That's the one that involves Hisashi Ouchi. But for the sake of clarity, let me discuss the 1997 accident real quick. This one occurred at PNC's bituminization facility. PNC is the Power Reactor and Nuclear Fuel Development Corporation. It's a Japanese nuclear energy research organization. That site was responsible for encasing and solidifying low-level nuclear waste in molten asphalt for storage. Sealing it this way is effective. Since it's low-level, it's not that intrinsically dangerous, but it still needs to be stored safely. That day, they were trialing a new asphalt waste mix, using 20% less asphalt than they usually did. But this mixture caused a chemical reaction inside one of the fresh barrels, and it ignited into a fire at about 10 a.m. on the 11th of March 1997. That quickly spread to other barrels, which is worse, and the workers failed to properly extinguish the fire. Smoke and radiation alarms went off, and it forced them to evacuate the building. However, by 8 p.m., it was thought things were okay. The fire had simmered down and it all seemed well. But built-up flammable gases then ignited and exploded, which broke windows and doors and allowed smoke and radiation to escape the building and into the surrounding area. That accident exposed 37 nearby personnel to trace amounts of radiation. At that time, it was actually considered the worst yet nuclear accident in Japan. It was rated a 3 on the International Nuclear Event Scale. It's not nearly as bad as it could have been, but it still released some radiation into the atmosphere, which is always bad. To make it worse, PNC actually mandated that 2 of their workers try to cover it up. They wanted them to falsely report the chronological events leading to the facility evacuation. The truth was that PNC had failed to properly supervise their workers. They really didn't know what to do exactly in the situation they were in, and they failed to immediately report the fire to the Science and Technology Agency. That delay hampered emergency response teams and prolonged radioactivity exposure, both of which are bad. The company's officials initially reported a 20% increase in radiation levels in the area surrounding the reprocessing plant, but it was not that low. It was actually 10 times higher than that. The residents in Tokai were of course furious and demanded criminal prosecution of the officials. In response to the public outcry, the facility was closed until November of the year 2000, when it was reinstated as a nuclear fuel reprocessing plant. However, in the grand scheme of things, the accident wasn't that bad. That one anyway. Because nobody died, and there aren't any known ill effects from the radiation exposure. Radiation's a really funny thing. Not haha funny, but like weird funny. It doesn't always hurt you, and low-level exposure can go unnoticed for the entirety of someone's life. The problem is even low-level exposure can cause nasty side effects involving damage at the cellular level. That can of course lead to things like cancer. So I guess the real terrifying thing about radiation, at least extreme ends of the radiation spectrum, is not really knowing how bad it's going to get for years. If it's not enough to kill you immediately, it might kill you decades later. It's important to understand that radiation is a very vague term. Technically, sunlight is radiation. Your computer monitor is throwing radiation in your face right now. But those are very low-level minor waves, things that we experience every day. Normal levels of radiation are of course fine because we, as living beings on this planet, have evolved to handle the normal levels that surrounds us all the time. But then there's ionizing radiation. And it's the kind of radiation that people are generally talking about when they talk about the dangers of radiation. Ionizing radiation is the stuff that can harm you very easily and without remorse. The reason why ionizing radiation is so dangerous is that they have the sufficient energy to ionize atoms or molecules by detaching electrons from them. When that kind of thing happens to the stuff that makes up our, cells in our bodies, that's some bad, really bad. Nuclear fission produces an absurd amount of ionizing radiation, and it has to be contained. Otherwise, bad things happen to good people, like Hisashi Ouchi. He was a married man, trying to work an honest job to make an honest living. 35 years old, and a fairly normal guy. His fate during this second accident is often overstated and exaggerated, but again, I'm here to tell you the truth of the matter. He did die, and it was not a very pleasant end at all. I will say that for those who are a bit squeamish, you may want to not listen to the rest of this video, because this is where things get real. I'm just going to warn you now. The second Tokai accident occurred in 1999, as I said, and it was much more serious than the first one. It actually happened 4 miles away from the PNC facility, on the 30th of September that year. This location was a fuel enrichment plant that was operated by a company called JCO. They are a Japanese nuclear fuel cycle company that was established in October of 1979. They were actually a subsidiary of the Sumitomo Metal Mining Company. The facility was responsible for converting uranium hexafluoride into enriched uranium dioxide fuel. That was the first step in creating nuclear fuel rods, which are a vital component for nuclear reactors. Enriching nuclear fuel requires very precise methodology. It's not something you can just do in your backyard. I mean, you could. You probably shouldn't, though. The sequence has to be very precise, and necessary safety and control measures must be in place in order for it to be conducted with minimal risk. Otherwise, it can produce its own fission reaction, well before it gets anywhere near an actual reactor. In order to enrich the uranium fuel, a specific chemical purification procedure is required. They had to feed small batches of uranium oxide powder into a designated dissolving tank that was filled with nitric acid. That would produce uranyl nitrate. That mixture is then carefully, very carefully, stress that, transported to a buffer tank. The buffer tank is specifically designed to prevent fission activity from reaching criticality. And you don't want that happening right now. This is not the time for that. From the buffer tank, everything moves to a precipitation tank. Ammonia is added, forming a solid product. That tank is meant to capture any remaining nuclear waste contaminants. In the final part of the process, uranium oxide is placed in the dissolving tanks until it's purified, without enriching the isotopes, in a wet process that was actually specialized by Japan. However, JCO started cutting corners on the process, which I don't want to hear cutting corners and nuclear in the same sentence under any circumstances, I just want to stress that. But they were told they had to increase efficiency, and therefore increase production. So they employed a violently illegal procedure where they skipped several steps in the process. The technicians were to pour the product by hand in stainless steel buckets directly into the precipitation tank, bypassing the buffer tank entirely. And that is where the accident starts. The technicians involved that day were Hisashi Ouchi, Masato Shinohara, and Yutaka Yokokawa. They were speeding up the last few steps of the conversion process to meet shipping requirements. Which, I've worked in a warehouse setup before. I totally understand the need to rush things at the end of the day in order to meet a quota. But I wasn't working with uranium. This isn't the kind of context where I think rushing would be, ideal. That's all I'm trying to say. But this was supposed to be JCO's first batch of fuel for the Joyo experimental fast breeder reactor. It was due to begin operation in 3 years. It's also important to mention that the employees in question had actually no proper qualifications for their job, and training, if there was any training, was minimal. Now how would you like that? You start work at a new job. Let's say it's McDonald's. Sure, why not? And your boss just throws you on the register and says, good luck. That's pretty much what happened here. The difference is, McDonald's is one of those jobs where, yeah, you might be frustrated on your first day with no real training, but you can count money. You know how a credit card works? It's possible for you to figure that out with nothing really terrible happening. There's a big difference between that and throwing someone on the job when they have to handle radioactive materials. Again, context, people. This is not the sort of setup where you can cut corners in any regard. I mean, come on. The team mixed the chemicals in the stainless steel buckets, which are not rated to handle this kind of situation. And they did follow the JCO operating manual guidance in that process, but weren't aware that it wasn't approved. The reason why these buckets are bad is, other than the fact that people are handling it, manually and can make mistakes very, very easily, especially when they're not trained and have no idea what the proper measurement should be. When they use a buffer tank, not only is the buffer tank designed to, again, prevent criticality from happening, but the automated setup gradually pumps the uranyl nitrate into the precipitation tank in 2.4 kilogram, 5.3 pound increments. It's a slower process, but it's way safer. Utilizing that measurement, you're pretty much guaranteed to never have a criticality accident. But when you're just tossing buckets into it, that's a totally different situation. At around 10:35 that day, the precipitation tank reached critical mass. That was right after the employees had added a 7th bucket that contained uranyl nitrate, which was enriched to 18.8% uranium-235. That solution, by the way, was almost 7 times the legal mass limit that was specified. As a result, an uncontrolled nuclear fission occurred immediately, and the resulting nuclear fission chain became self-sustaining. It emitted intense gamma and neutron radiation. At the time of the event, Ouchi actually had his body draped over the tank, while Shinohara stood on a platform to assist in pouring the solution. Yokokawa was sitting at a desk that was 4 meters away. All 3 of them observed a blue flash, which was possibly Cherenkov radiation, and the radiation alarms went off. Over the next several hours, the fission reaction produced continuous chain reactions. Ouchi and Shinohara were not in a good situation. They immediately experienced pain, nausea, and difficulty breathing, all symptoms of radiation sickness. Both workers went into the decontamination room, where Ouchi vomited. Given he's the focus here, you probably aren't surprised to know that he received the highest dose of radiation. Some sources incorrectly state that he's received the highest dose of radiation that any human has ever gotten, ever. That's not true. There's been several cases of people getting higher doses than him, but the point is, his dose was very, very high. He suffered rapid difficulties with his mobility, coherence, and he began to lose consciousness. The 3 men evacuated, but due to their lack of qualifications and training, none of them really knew the impact of the accident, or the reporting criteria for that matter. A worker in the next building became aware of the injured employees, and he contacted emergency medical assistance. An ambulance took them to the nearest hospital, and the products of the fission reaction, which was still ongoing by the way, contaminated the fuel reprocessing building and the area immediately outside the facility. Emergency service workers arrived and escorted other plant workers outside of the facility's muster zones. The self-sustaining reaction wasn't actually stopped until the next morning. The workers managed to drain the water from the surrounding cooling jacket installed on the precipitation tank. That water was serving as a neutron reflector. Once they did that, they added a boric acid solution to the precipitation tank to reduce all contents to subcritical levels. A lot of radiation contaminated the outside of the facility, of course. By mid-afternoon, the day it happened, plant workers and surrounding residents were asked to evacuate. Then, 12 hours after the incident, 300,000 surrounding residents of the nuclear facility were told to stay indoors and cease all agricultural production. That restriction was lifted the following afternoon after the event was, of course, stopped. Almost 15 days later, the facility instituted protection methods with sandbags and other shielding to protect from residual gamma radiation. Confusion and panic followed the event because there was no emergency plan or even public communication from JCO. Authorities just told them not to harvest crops or drink the well water. Officials had to ease public concerns by radiation testing the residents living approximately 6 miles away from the facility. Dozens of emergency workers and residents who lived nearby were hospitalized, and hundreds of thousands of others were forced to remain indoors for 24 hours. At least 667 workers, first responders, and nearby residents were exposed to excess radiation as a result of the accident. Even after the plant was sealed, radioactive gas levels stayed high in the area, and at first they didn't know why. But finally, on October 12th, they realized that a roof ventilation fan had been left on, so they turned it off to stop that. Despite the severity, it was still classified as an irradiation, not contamination accident, under level 4 of the nuclear event scale. So it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it still wasn't good. That labeled the situation low risk outside of the facility. The technicians and workers in the facility were measured for radiation contamination. However, none of them got it as bad as the 3 technicians who actually caused the accident due to improper training. It's probably worth mentioning at this point that there's a few ways to measure radiation. The one we're using in this case are sieverts. Sieverts is a unit of the International System of Units intended to represent the stochastic health risk in ionizing radiation. For nuclear technicians, the maximum allowable dose that is still considered within safety limits is 50 millisieverts, not even 1 sievert, and that's for Japanese nuclear workers. Some of the other plant workers got irradiated to a certain degree, testing up to 23 millisieverts, and local residents hit 15 millisieverts, but the 3 technicians we started the story with were far beyond milli. According to official testing by the STA, Ouchi suffered 17 sieverts of radiation, Shinohara 10, and Yokokawa 3. Yutaka Yokokawa was actually their supervisor. He actually received treatment from the National Institute of Radiological Sciences in Shiba, and he was released 3 months later with minor radiation sickness, and would wind up surviving. Masato Shinohara, who again received 10 sieverts, was 40 years old and transported to the University of Tokyo Hospital. Doctors made many attempts to save his life, but due to the radiation sickness, he was suffering terribly. He had to deal with radical cancer treatment, as well as numerous successful skin grafts, because his skin was literally disintegrating. He lasted 7 months, and died of organ failure on the 27th of April, 2000. He wasn't able to fight many radiation-induced infections, as well as internal bleeding. His lung and kidneys gave out. And again, he wasn't nearly as bad as Hisashi Ouchi. He was at the same hospital as Shinohara, University of Tokyo, and he lasted 83 days, and some sources say that was probably way too long, cause, yo, I'm gonna preface this with the fact that some people claim that the doctors kept him alive only for scientific reasons, just to see the progression, as if he was some kind of guinea pig. But that's not true. For one thing, Ouchi was not in a position to really speak. His levels of cohesion bounced back and forth early on, but for the most part he really couldn't communicate. His next of kin, his family, begged the doctors to keep him alive, even when his heart stopped, multiple times. And under Japanese law, the doctors were legally obligated to proceed with treatment until nothing more could be done, with the exception of express permission from Ouchi. But Ouchi couldn't give permission because he wasn't able to communicate, and his family wanted them to keep trying. So let me stress right now, the story that the doctors kept him alive as some kind of research subject just to see what would happen to him is a total fabrication. That is not at all what happened. The doctors were operating within the guidelines they were given, the law and the family. They didn't have another option. If they had let him die, they could have faced legal retaliation, possibly even murder charges. Which is unfortunate because Ouchi really wasn't going to make it, and that was pretty evident early on. He suffered serious radiation burns on most of his body. Remember, he was draped over the tank when the criticality event went off, so he was blasted pretty much literally in the face with ionizing radiation. He also suffered severe damage to his internal organs, and he had a near zero white blood cell count. Since his immune system just wasn't working, he was very vulnerable to hospital-borne pathogens, or just pathogens in general. So he was placed in a special radiation ward to limit the risk of him contracting an infection at all. The first step was trying to restore function to his immune system, and they administered a peripheral blood stem cell transplantation, which was actually very new at the time. He received a transplant from his sister, but the problem was everything else. Like, his immune system was an issue, but his body was falling to pieces, and I mean that quite literally. His cells were ripped to shreds. The leukocytes being produced by the transplanted tissue were actually mutated by the residual radiation present in his body, and that triggered autoimmune responses that made his situation worse, and his white blood cell count went down again. They repeatedly tried cultured skin grafts and pharmacological interventions with painkillers, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and granulocyte colony-stimulating factor, but none of it worked. Ouchi's family continued to ask the doctors to keep reviving him, even though his heart had stopped repeatedly, and it was clear to the doctors that his body had sustained so much damage that it was basically untreatable. There was really nothing they could do. At some point, the family finally realized this, and decided that if his heart stopped again, they wouldn't force it this time. Despite the doctor's best efforts, there really wasn't anything to be done at this point. His skin was effectively dissolving. His internal organs weren't working anymore. Some sources say his DNA had effectively been ripped apart, and the human body just has no way to recover from this type of damage, and his condition finally deteriorated into multiple organ failure. He finally passed away on the 21st of December 1999, following a cardiac arrest. He lived in that horrific state for 83 days, though some sources mention that the doctors may have actually put him in a medically induced coma, which I hope they did, because being awake for any of that would have been absolutely horrific. Following this horrible incident, investigation, of course, was carried out. It was decided the accident was caused by poor management of the operation manuals, failure to qualify technicians and engineers, as well as improper procedures associated with handling nuclear chemicals. Basically, JCO had cut corners. What they were doing was actually illegal, straight up. And to be honest, they're lucky that only 3 people died, because it could have been a lot worse. In October 1999, JCO set up advisory booths to process compensation claims and inquiries of those affected by the accident. Since over 600 people were actually exposed to radioactivity, there were a lot of claims. By July of 2000, over 7,000 compensation claims were filed and settled. In September of 2000, JCO agreed to pay $121 million in compensation to settle 6,875 claims from people exposed to radiation and affected agricultural and service businesses. All residents within 350 meters of the incident and those forced to evacuate received compensation if they agreed not to sue the company in the future. In late March 2000, the STA canceled JCO's credentials for operation serving as the first Japanese plant operator to be punished by law for mishandling nuclear radiation. That suit was followed by the company president's resignation. In October, 6 officials from JCO were charged with professional negligence derived from failure to properly train technicians and knowingly subverting safety procedures. In April of 2001, all 6 of them pleaded guilty to a charge of negligence resulting in death. That included Yokokawa, since he was the supervisor on duty. The JCO president also pleaded guilty on behalf of the company. During the trial, the jury learned that a 1995 JCO safety committee had approved the use of steel buckets in the procedure. On top of that, a widely distributed but an authorized 1996 manual recommended the use of buckets in making the solution. The STA report indicated JCO management had permitted that, beginning in 1993, to shortcut the conversion process, even though they knew well and good that the whole thing was completely illegal and wildly irresponsible. Special laws were also put in place stipulating operational safety procedures and quarterly inspection requirements. These inspections focused on the proper conduct of workers and leadership. They mandated both safety education and quality assurance of all facilities and activities associated with nuclear power generation. Starting in the year 2000, Japan's atomic and nuclear commissions began regular investigations of these facilities, and that continued well on into the next decade. New systems were put in place for handling a similar accident, with governing legislature and institutions in an effort to prevent future situations from occurring at all. Japan still uses a lot of nuclear power, but there's a lot more pushback of it due to these accidents. It got a lot worse with Fukushima, though in fairness, in that instance, that was due to the tsunami, so it wasn't quite the same as the 1999 accident. And as for Hisashi Ouchi, well, I gotta be honest with you, it kind of annoys me how many people state his fate wrong. A lot of sources say a lot of stuff about it that just aren't correct, and in my opinion, we kind of owe it to people like Ouchi to tell the truth of their story. That he was a victim of corporate negligence, not a bunch of doctors running a weird science experiment. Like I said, they didn't have a choice. JCO did, and they made the wrong one. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Somedude267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, DM Trouble Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Alaric Jaspers, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Major Klutz, Hayden DeGrow, Ohio Trucker 1, Ty Hammonds Jr., and Master of None. Till next time, this is Darkness, and a bit all fun, farewell.